So that's the reason Kordia started doing this about 9 years ago, to actually go, what's really happening in New Zealand? So we survey businesses between about 50 seats up to, plus.
But every business needs to take cybersecurity seriously, and those that are smaller organisations, it becomes quite a challenge.
I would like to say it's just the small ones. I would say.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and today it's great to have Alistair Miller, Principal Advisory Consultant at Aura Information Security, joining me. Now, before we start, a big thank you to our show partners, to 1NZ, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP, and Gorilla Technology. We appreciate their support of the New Zealand Tech Podcast and the broader tech and innovation ecosystems in New Zealand. How are you, Alistair?
I'm great. And yourself, Paul?
Good. Really privileged to have you joining us on the show today. Really interested to delve into Kordia's report. Now, of course, Aura is, I guess, a division or a subsidiary of Kordia, and each year we get the annual cybersecurity report that comes through. And there's a number of companies that do these sorts of reports on a global basis from differing perspectives, but generally companies that are they live and breathe and work in the cybersecurity space in one form or another. And I think what I appreciate around Kordia's report is you get out and you survey quite a broad bunch of business leaders, and it's very much local to New Zealand. So, I think there's interesting aspects we get through from the varying reports. But maybe you can, walk us through a little bit, what it looks like to collate a report like this, and who those folks are that tend to, be feeding into the process.
Sure. So when we go and talk to clients, as you say, they see those big reports from the Verizons, the NTTs, the CrowdStrikes, and they're very international. At the best, you get APAC, Asia Pacific, and they don't feel that reflects New Zealand. Even something that covers Australia and New Zealand, Australia's cybersecurity market is quite different.
Yes.
So they're like, but what does this mean for New Zealand? Is what I'm experiencing, similar for other businesses? So that's the reason Kordia started doing this about 9 years ago, to actually go, what's really happening in New Zealand? So we survey businesses between about 50 seats up to, plus. So we're kind of three big distinct marks: 50 to 100, 100 to 250, 250 plus. And we got about a third of each on asking these questions. Sent the questionnaire out to all the sort of what they called the cybersecurity decision makers. Now that is one of the interesting first slides in the actual report, is who decides is a cybersecurity decision maker. And the interesting part on that one was only 8% actually wore the hat of a CISO or an information security manager. The rest of those decision makers were other people: CFOs, owners, directors, people wearing multiple hats. So that was one of the first terrifying things from the report for me, was the fact that it's now so few businesses have a sole person who actually makes those decisions in cybersecurity. If you're a CFO, you're a busy person. You're doing a lot of other stuff. Having cybersecurity as a second job is slightly terrifying, because it's not high on your priorities.
Yeah, and this is probably a reflection of the scale of a lot of our New Zealand businesses, right? We don't have so many larger businesses, but every business needs to take cybersecurity seriously, and those that are smaller organisations, it becomes quite a challenge.
I would like to say it's just the small ones. I would say in that 250 seats well up, there's surprisingly a lack of sort of skilled and unique decision makers in cybersecurity, CISOs and the equivalent. It's definitely a reflection in New Zealand that it's not quite seen as essential, which makes sense with, there isn't the compliance regime that is in many other countries around the world. So if the government's not beating you or the regulator with a stick, you're going to take it as easy as you think you can get away with. So that is reflected in the survey.
So now, looking at the report, there's a lot in there in terms of what are the ways in which organisations are getting hit, trends, and so on. Overall, it seems like from the perspective of your report, and these things, as I say, do vary from report to report. Even other data kind of coming out locally from government and so on. But what you got back from those that you surveyed was quite an increase. But you also kind of looked at global stats as well. So what can you share there in terms of what is actually going on? Should we be getting a little bit more relaxed that we've, as organisations, most are more mature than they were a year ago, and some of those easy vectors, in theory, most organisations have improved in a number of areas? Or are these stats sort of telling us that yes, we may have improved in some areas? The reality is far more complicated.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's just proving that it's the same old stuff hitting organisations again and again. So it's again, are you configuring your clouds properly? Every New Zealand business is using cloud services in some fashion. Do you actually have people in your organisation who know what they're doing when they do this? Often you don't. You have people who get stuff up and running. So it's all working and everyone's happy. But have you secured it? Do you understand the security around it? And that is one of the major factors where people get breached. They haven't configured these things properly. They've left stuff open, and so they get hit. And you'd like to say that gets better, but there's a skill set shortage in New Zealand. You don't have enough people to do those jobs. You've got enough people to get them up and working, but to actually secure them and get them in a state that makes them secure is a limit. Even if you're partnering with a security or a service provider organisation, there's a limit to what they'll do. Again, they focus on getting it up and running. They're not so worried unless you've explicitly told them, secure it. Because there's always an assumption that it's a cloud service run by one of the big providers, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Oracles. It's secure, but that is unfortunately a bit of a fallacy.
Yes, yeah. I guess if you look at sort of the standard security that comes from any sort of cloud offering, even your standard software as a service product, I notice in most cases, and I was looking at some software today. I think there were 4 or 5 tiers of the software, and you had to be on the very top enterprise tier to get access to single sign-on that would really then have the smarts to be able to fully evaluate whether you were a legitimate party kind of logging in versus sort of the lighter versions, and that's just one aspect. Where are the areas that I guess when it comes to cloud world where you're sort of seeing the most common kind of everyday mistakes when it comes to securing them?
Unfortunately, it's the sort of AWS and Amazon and Microsoft, because they are such big players. Every business in New Zealand is probably touching one, maybe with Google Cloud as well. So they offer so much as well. I mean, the product portfolio is massive. You could pretty much run your whole organisation on one of those platforms. Unfortunately, that means there is so much. It's so interconnected. It's so hard to understand it all that most organisations can't. They can get stuff up and running again, but to really have the time and a sort of requirements to secure it is something they just never get round to. Yeah. Because often a CTO or a CIO, once something's working, their attention moves to the next thing that needs to be working. And there's no one else to go and say, actually, have we, as you say, put SSO in place? Is there MFA? Have we actually removed all the default credentials that just go admin to give you access to it all? And it's unfortunately missed out.
Yeah. So I saw some of the data was saying global cyber attacks increased by 44%, and we're now seeing predictions that cybercrime could reach $23 trillion by 2027. How do you get your head around those sort of numbers? I mean, that's pretty insane. And even though I guess New Zealand is a small percentage of the global economy, even a small slice of 23 trillion is going to have a fairly serious impact on a country like New Zealand. Yeah,
and unfortunately on the individuals, especially when it actually hits them as an individual rather than an organisation. But these organisations are often servicing individuals, so it's the human impact as much as it is the tech impact that you do have to think about. But it's going to be a drag on the economy because maybe your insurer pays, maybe they don't. Maybe you can claim some money back from a bank. But, the organisation almost have to self-insure when these things happen to try and recover their reputation or get things back up and running. So it's a hit on the economy as well as, the impact on the business. If they can't work, you can't get your services. So as Auckland Transport had about 18 months ago, you couldn't get on a train, you couldn't get on a bus because the tagging wasn't working properly. Impacts everyone when these things happen.
Yeah, well, something like that can have a long-term flow on. For some, it's just, we'll figure something out for a couple of days. For others, it's, I knew it was a waste of time to try this public transport thing, and I'm not going to go back. Right? There'll be varying variations, and so when you stack those things up, it doesn't necessarily look good. One organisation I was speaking to a while back, had really interesting discussion around the impact of a cyber attack on their business, and then I saw a headline maybe sort of 18 months after or 2 years after this had taken place, and they were out of business. And when they just sort of described the impact of the cybersecurity incident, you could see how that was one part of ending their business. Not the only part, I don't think, but the current economy and so on has been a challenge. But I think sometimes we're a little bit relaxed around the impact when, especially for those organisations, maybe had something of reasonably minor impact in the past, and so there becomes an assumption like we can cope with a cyber attack. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, there very much is that kind of idea that you've only experienced something minor when someone's email account got compromised, and you're like, well, we survived that. It just took us a few hours. So you get a bit complacent. And we do find this. We talk to organisations and tell them what other people experience, but they're very much, I've not experienced that, so I don't believe it really happens. So you do have to persuade people that their own experience is not reflexive of the whole world. So that is tricky. And obviously, as you say, if you're in a competitive market and can't trade for a whole week, your clients are going to go somewhere else, and then can you come back?
Yep. Now, there's been, I think, a lot of consideration around what role will artificial intelligence, play going forwards. At the moment, your report is saying, I think 28% of the bigger end of town, the large New Zealand organisations, consider AI-generated cyber attacks, as a top threat. But I guess across the board, most of us probably aren't seeing anything significant from that perspective at the moment. What can you tell us around the role of AI in cyber attacks, at the moment from what you've been seeing?
Well, those phishing emails have got better. So AI is really polished. In the old days where it was badly written, didn't make much sense. Now they're brilliant. They really are very good. They can affect the branding, so it can make it look like it is the company that you're expecting it to be. So you probably are seeing it in your inbox even now. So obviously a lot of these ones will filter out some stuff, but it will be getting through. And then obviously the text messages, some of them are terrible you get now, but they will get better, and they do get better. And obviously the really scary one is the video calls. So most people don't do day-to-day video calls unless you're at work, so less of an issue, but they can be very realistic. And there's lots of accounts of businesses actually hiring people from North Korea who were, hacked into the business not hacked into the business, they actually employed them, but they were using AI to fake their video, fake their voice, all these kind of things. And these are a lot of tech companies. So, you'd think they'd be a bit more au fait about what they should be doing, but no, they still hire people. So AI is going to superpower attackers because they have access to all those AI tools out there and a very low barrier to entry because, if they fail, it doesn't matter. So they can just go out and try.
Yeah. So what have you seen on the North Korean sort of hiring situation? I remember reading around, KnowBe4 kind of, falling for this. And then I think, the employee who had been sent a laptop and so on, reasonably quickly, they were able to isolate what was going on and block that. Any scenarios of that happening to New Zealand companies that you're aware of at this point?
Not that I'm aware of now, because New Zealand isn't quite as sort of keen on the really remote workers. So they do tend to like to sort of be able to touch and feel most people. But some businesses are very much distributed workforce around the world, especially in the dev space.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are occasions where people suddenly have a sinking feeling, but the issue with cybercrime is often people feel very embarrassed and don't want to report it. So again, this is the report is kind of the tip of the iceberg. This is where people are willing to admit mistakes, and the same with the other ones where they put numbers against them and volumes. A lot of people go, "Oh, I'm just not going to talk about this. We won't say anything. We'll put in some controls to try and stop us hiring North Koreans," but they won't sort of inform the wider world.
Yeah. So, do you have any view on how much goes unreported? Because I think many of us have felt for a long time that certain reports are coming through from varying directions are probably really, really undercooking the scale of the impact on especially when we look at New Zealand. But I always find it hard to know, well, what would be the actual real scale, and how do you get closer to the reality?
I think it's probably 80-20, so 20% gets reported, 80% doesn't.
Yeah.
Because in being in the business, lots of organisations that have had issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not reported anywhere.
That's so true.
It disappears.
Yeah.
So you can kind of go, I doubt the government knows. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So it's not going in those reports or police or NetSafe. So it's people like to sweep it under the carpet if they can, which to some sense makes sense for them. But which is the reason why the Australians have tried to change their laws to make it mandatory to report to them if you've had an attack, if you've paid ransom, so they can get a real idea and a firm sort of view of what is really going on in the real world, because it is a lot of people sweeping stuff under a carpet.
Yeah, yeah. What's your view on our current legislation when it comes to, in relation to cyber things? I mean, mostly it seems that the legislation that relates to cyber is our privacy legislation, which is, I tend to call it a bit of a wet bus ticket or similar. How important do you think it is to keep raising the expectations on organisations, on boards, on reporting and alerting what is going on and what has happened?
Unfortunately, it is compliance driven. So if people aren't made to do it, they will do as little as possible. It makes business sense. You invest the money where you can get the biggest returns. And so while cybersecurity can help you, deliver products to clients in a secure fashion, it's not going to sort of, radically change your business. So without those laws that say we expect these minimums, minimum security controls in place, reporting, other kind of things, it's always going to lag, which is the noticeable difference between now Australia and New Zealand is that Australia is really taking this very seriously, has a lot of quite tough laws in place, especially around what they call SOCI, or the critical infrastructure, which is quite a broad subject now in there. So it's it covers medical, finance, obviously all the utilities, ports. So those things that really everyone depends on have to live up to quite a lot.
Which I think is as it should be. We should have high expectations of those organisations to secure themselves, secure the systems that they're responsible for, and the associated data. Now, looking at sort of the common attack vectors, it seems as though phishing attacks continue to be pretty significant. Is that coming down a bit now? What are the changes?
Sadly not. Phishing is the easiest way to break into an organisation. You can send out millions of emails and you just need a few clicks. And every organisation, whether they admit it or not, has a couple of chronic clickers who they will just click stuff. And then I've actually been recently having conversations with businesses about what do you do with your chronic clickers? You can't train them. They're beyond training. They will just click stuff. I don't know, some psychological thing that I'm just tempted. I'll just click it. So how do you manage the risk they pose to the business for someone will do something that will expose their account to an attacker? And that is a tricky conversation where businesses have difficulties dealing with it. When the executive, it's not too hard. You can put an EA who kind of screens their inbox. But if it's kind of someone in finance or someone in shipping, what do? You can't really take away a computer from someone, but they can't really be trusted with it. So it's a tricky one to how you manage those people.
Yes, and maybe walk us through sort of what examples are you seeing out there in organisations of how they do address that. And we're sort of aware of a range of approaches, whether it's being hauled in front of somebody or needing to do more and more retraining? What do you think are the most sort of effective techniques, short of, exiting someone from their computer use, which is probably pretty hard if that's what someone does in their role?
Yeah, I mean, these people are untrainable, so you can have them do training every day. It wouldn't make a difference. So it is how you control their account, what they have access to. Obviously, then you put all those checks and balances in. So especially if they're in finance or something like this, they can't do stuff without it being double checked. But it's really tricky for a business to go, I've got a person who's not quite fit for purpose in this role because they can't stop clicking on stuff. So it becomes very much an HR issue as much as a tech issue, because you want them to do their job. They could be very good at their job. They have just got this massive risk to the business.
Yeah. I guess there are sort of conditional authentication type technologies that you can, maybe turn the screws a little bit on certain users.
You can a bit.
And up the ante, but yeah, that's maybe not not infallible either, right?
It's not, I mean, the interesting thing to always view it is, you get a sort of driving license to take a car, but anyone can open up a laptop and be given access to all kinds of parts of a business. And that does have repercussions of the risk it does pose. So businesses do have to assume that for a few people, they will pose a significant risk.
Yeah. Have you seen any businesses that are now incorporating that into their hiring and HR process, so that they'll actually put somebody through a test before they start, rather than hiring somebody who's maybe more susceptible to risk? I imagine there are some organisations where that would actually be pretty helpful.
It would be. And obviously, some of the companies do have psychometric testing as part of their hiring, but I've yet to hear of one who's doing that. I mean, it's certainly a good business opportunity possibly for people, is how cyber savvy are your employees before you employ them? Because as everything is through that computer, and that account will have so much power, are you confident in them to have the abilities to do their role securely? Are
you seeing any elements of this sort of come through in, I guess the likes of, annual reviews, and, how much is it increasing within the human resources kind of world, the importance of cyber, and, is it getting out to that level on a common basis, or is that sort of
HR sadly
uncommon?
Only kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff for a lot of this stuff. It is getting that training as much as you can for most employees, getting them used to doing stuff and getting them confident in reporting when they've done something stupid. So as you say, if you do haul people in front of a boss to get shouted at, they're going to hide and they're going to not say anything. So you want a really open culture that means if you've made a mistake, quickly say something so people can disable your account and lock you down. So it's very much an open and caring environment, as opposed to one that's going to scream and shout at people.
Yes, yeah. And so, in addition to to phishing, what are our other sort of top sort of vectors here in New Zealand at the moment?
So it's that cloud environment again, unsecured, those web applications. So all those websites you go to have the developers left in the classic things of hard coding credentials, allowing various injection techniques through, so they can get access to the back end and pull data out. Those are some classic ones that really impact businesses and can cause attackers to get quite deep into them and extract a lot of data, or just shut them down. So again, it comes back to, are the employees, while they're creating stuff, securing it at the same time, which especially with developers, where you go to university and do a computer science course, it's very much, let's go and build stuff, let's get stuff running. But most of those courses do not have a secure coding module in them at all. So people aren't trained to do it. They're not trained to think about it. So they get stuff up and running. It's lovely. It looks beautiful. It works a dream. But unfortunately, it's got gaping holes in it.
I did see a report recently, and I just was having a look to see if I could see something similar in yours, talking to, and this might have been from the NCSC, a reduction in ransomware. What have you been seeing on that front?
This is a fascinating topic that people have very different opinions. So kind of we looked at about, sort of 10% of people paid ransom usually, maybe up to 15 if you're kind of looking at, which is what kind of a bit more than I expected now. Yeah. Because most people have got better at recovering themselves from it, so not having to pay.
Yeah.
But other people say, oh no, it's way bigger. It's 30, 40%.
Yeah, okay.
But with no mandatory reporting, it gets tricky to know exactly.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I guess those who have maybe come out the other side are much, in a lot of cases they're not necessarily going to be reporting that, back to the likes of CERT and the National Cybersecurity Centre, right? We got away with it. They're not mandated to, so sometimes the government data can be a bit lacking, as probably everybody's is when it comes to collecting these things.
If they've tied it to a privacy breach, so obviously if the Privacy Commission has been involved, then the government we ought to harvest some better details because they'll understand the whole event. But if it wasn't, sensitive data extracted, there's no reason why they should report it. And if you can bury it in New Zealand, you can.
And when it comes to paying those ransoms, how would you explain the risks, right? Because some of the nations, as Kiwis, we're not supposed to be trading with, right? Yep. So if you've got a hack that's kind of associated with North Korea, which, depending on, I guess, how far you delve, you may not necessarily know that yet. If you were to, send your Bitcoin payment off to North Korea, you can maybe get in a spot of bother for that, or is this the sort of thing that usually just sort of flies under the radar and no one gets held to account for breaching laws that limit which nations you should be doing business with?
Certainly, as you're right, there's sanctioned nations, and the US and the UK and some of the other sort of Five Eyes take it more seriously than others. Certainly, I've never heard of anyone actually being sanctioned, but you can imagine for political reasons, if the wrong organisation paid North Korea, then the justice system may be weaponized against them because they don't quite fit in the political system. So it's a risk you run yourself into. And obviously, if it is someone like the North Koreans, it's an industry there. The whole economy is backed by this. So if they know that you're going to pay and that you've got those flaws, they're going to come back. So paying is a great risk. But as you say, if the business could go under without it, it may be a risk you're willing to take. But that is where using proper negotiators is absolutely key, because they can give you an idea of who these people are to a degree, whether they're trustworthy. So are you going to get your data back? Are you going to get keys? Will they try and blackmail you later? So you can at least make a semi-informed decision rather than just, as you say, just sending your Bitcoin out into the ether and fingers crossed that the future is happy.
And should we be a little bit more relaxed around, the likes of, what we're our DHBs, Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, who, are responsible for a lot of confidential data about Kiwis from a health perspective, when we look at it from the angle that, our government doesn't tend to pay out, these sorts of ransoms. Do you think the habits kind of change, or is so much of this automated that, look, they're just, if their automated tools manage to get into an organisation, they're just going to do the same tricks again, even if there's a very low chance that a ransom's actually going to get paid out?
The really clever organisations are researching their targets. So, this is why American healthcare organisations do get hit so often. It's constant, because they are, a lot of them are independent, they're private, and so they need to pay to, get back up and running with the hospital, because state ones, as you say, don't really work the same way, and governments, maybe they pay ransoms, but no one ever hears about it, so much less likely to happen. So any of the really professional ones are not going to bother hitting state-run health organisations, because you just kind of make yourself look bad if it ever gets attributed to you, and you're probably not getting any money. But obviously, as you say, there's automated tools running. There's people who are starting off who are just kind of playing. They may well do it because they see a vulnerability and they jump in, and then, they like to get some money, but they're not going to. But unfortunately, no one's having any operations for the next few days.
Yeah. And we're also starting to sort of see that flip side, aren't we, where they'll go after the individuals whose data that they've taken. So they might say, well, actually, we will go after Kiwi's data, but we're going to hit up those people individually and try and recover funds on a per person basis rather than trying to get it back from a government level. Is that something you've seen happening locally yet?
Not for healthcare, but for financial information. Yes, there's been reports of some people who, they've attempted to blackmail them for only like $50, $100, nothing massive. But yeah, these attackers will, beyond the double dip, they will keep trying to reuse it. They'll try and blackmail the organization. They'll try and ransomware them. They'll do individuals. They're very innovative because, they'll try and make as much money as possible.
Yeah. And I guess we look back at the report. Walk us through how prepared our businesses are now from a cyber perspective. Are we how much better are we getting or not getting?
I think people are getting more aware that they're not very well prepared.
Yeah.
So about half of businesses say they've got an incident response plan. But when we see those incident response plans, they're very vague. There are a few bullet points. They're not considering, and this is the most important part in an incident response plan, is who am I going to be talking to at each stage of an incident? Because you've got the mandatory people you need to be talking to, your board. You might have a regulator if you're in the financial or medical sector. You're going to have you might want to talk to the police or NCSC. You need to have all that written out, who you're going to talk to, when, what your legal obligations are. Otherwise, things get missed out, and that's often what we see during an incident is a lot of stuff gets missed out, and then they come back to it when, especially if you've talked to an insurer, they'll bring in the big guns who will then have to restart the incident essentially and go, okay, let's take it from here. So having a good plan and actually doing tabletop exercises to practice it is absolutely key, because that's often in a stress-free environment because it's not real, but you're practicing it, that people actually start sweating a bit, realizing the massive gaps they really have. Yeah.
And who are the organisations that you're seeing sort of, take these things most seriously and are, getting in there and, auditing and finding out where they're at, where the gaps are, and then working through those things, keeping their boards in the loop of what's being found? Is there a particular sort of flavour to those who are at the more right end of things?
Well, medical and financial ones do take it more seriously, but it really is board driven. So if you've got a member on your board who has an interest in cybersecurity, was on another board, or part of an executive who got breached, that means an organisation will take it more seriously. So surprisingly, there's some industries that you wouldn't think they're really into that at all. And cybersecurity it's not the major part of their business, but take it really seriously because there is someone on that board who is driving it through. So they're in a really strong part where some financial ones are a bit lax because, the board aren't driving it. No one's experienced it before. So as you say, there's people go, she'll be right.
So that's mostly where you'd be getting engaged for that sort of work is coming sort of from the top level down to do those.
Yeah, it's the only way cybersecurity really works in an organisation is if the board cares. Because if the board cares, the executive care, and if the executive care, staff care. If there's a missing layer at that top, then the executive will just do enough to allow compliance and
It gets that investment.
Yeah.
Interestingly, my team just been recently involved with, and we work with sort of smaller end of town, compared to most of what you do. But we were working with an organisation sort of sub 200 people, and it actually came from the IT team internally, and they decided, look, we think we're doing a pretty good job, but actually, we can see some benefit in having our homework checked, as it were. And it was a really interesting engagement. And then I guess that created for them an opportunity to pass information, back to senior leadership and to the board. And I think one of the potentials in that case is helping the board who might not be necessarily, in some cases so interested in cybersecurity, realise, oh yeah, we do have some risks here that we weren't aware of, and then they're more open to making some budget available to go and resolve those things, because I think there'll be a bunch of people listening that are different levels within their organisations, and some will be struggling to get maybe the funding that they need from a cybersecurity perspective. Yet if they were to, I guess, front up, to their board with a little bit of a report saying, hey, we've got some gaps here and we need, X amount to invest to resolve those. Maybe that could work as well.
Well, you could also invite the chair of the board to actually sit on one of these tabletop type exercises. So they're there. So they ask the questions.
Yeah.
And they see the good things, they'll see the bad things. And this seems to be a bit of a bad culture, is where people won't admit where they're weak, because they try and hide it. But if you don't admit, you can't help fix it. So being frank and honest with the board of, as you say, this has got some risks, some problems. We need help to fix it, because you're showing all the willing. But if you're going and hiding all your problems, then it's just going to fester there. It's not going to get better. So inviting the executive and getting the board involved actually lets them see what's going well and what's going badly.
Yep, that's a good point. Now, you sort of talked about cloud systems, before. These days, a lot of organisations have got, custom code. They've got different tools that kind of, stick together with, I guess you could say virtual versions of sellotape and, chewing gum to kind of hold them together. There's a whole range of interesting sort of systems out there. Are you seeing, organisations, recognising more the importance of sort of getting the security, across these systems improved, or are we still sort of, I guess, caught in this position where developers and tech teams and so on are so stretched that really something only gets attention if it comes back from an audit, rather than just starting to become a day-to-day norm to be looking to continuously improve in these areas?
Sadly, you're right. It's usually when something goes wrong that most of the time that gets pulled out, because, again, it's not someone's full-time responsibility. When you do have your CISOs or your information security manager, they're focused on making these things secure, robust, and so if there's not someone doing that, it's going to be a client complaint. You may get someone, trying to break into your website, and then you go, okay, we better have a look at this. Or as you say, you might get a pen test on your website and it comes back with a terrible report and you do something about it. But at least if you were doing a pen test, it shows that you do try and do stuff. And as our report says, many organizations are not even doing that level of doing one annually.
Yeah. And what are the systems that, you think that organizations should be, prioritizing to look at to get that kind of external viewpoint on the most? Is there, particular areas that you suggest should always be, right at the top of the list?
Well, any web app that's allowing the general public to log into, you definitely always want to be testing that. Obviously, if it's got financial or other sensitive information, you have to do that, because the risk is so bad. But any remote desktop type technology, now that's got less and less as more stuff has moved to the cloud, but there's still quite a few organizations who will use that. Now, if that's not well configured, people then can hop themselves into your organization and they're away. They've got past all the controls on the outside. They're in the little squidgy bit on the inside. So that's absolutely key. And then as you're talking about integrations, so if you've got APIs, they can be well configured, they can be badly configured. So checking those connections between your various services. Are they changing credentials every few months? Are they secure? Just having a look to make sure that they've all been configured well, rather than just configured so things work.
Yeah, it can definitely be a challenge, and it's the issue of there being too much to do, not enough time, right? So,
yes.
Yep. And what approach do you recommend in terms of educating those that sit within the varying areas of IT, be it software developers, IT administrators, and so on? What's the current thinking from your perspective?
Well, if you're about to kick off a project, the best idea is to to just do a bit of threat modeling on it. So who might attack it and what might they do? Now, the devs will actually, if you take them through this process, have massive amount of ideas because they can think, how would I exploit what we're about to do? But this tends not to happen. And so as you go further and further down a project, the more expensive it comes to fix stuff.
Yep.
So if you take that, we're about to launch a new website, a new service, let's do some threat modeling just to think, it doesn't have to be really rigorous. Just start thinking about it and go, oh, if we don't do this, this will be a major issue. So we'll put some controls in place to avoid it. So some thinking early really does solve it. And it kind of means that the kickoff process for each project has a bit of threat modeling at it.
What would you say is the sort of percentage of dev teams that are taking this seriously when they're building code? I can see you almost cracking up and falling off your chair there. But
it is very small. I mean, unless they've been educated in some kind of secure design lifecycle approach where there is some gates you have to step through. They just want to get in there. They want to get coding. They want to get something up and running. So you either need to sort of find a security champion within a dev team.
Yeah.
That does work quite well. A security champion, and then they can work within that team or maybe a few other teams. But unless there's, again, that ownership of security, people will just focused on getting stuff up and running.
So many of these things really come back to to us as the humans in the mix. It's not so much the technology. It's people.
It is always people. Yeah. We can be incredibly good at it or incredibly bad.
Yeah. Now, what about Internet of Things? The IoT world is it's continued to grow over recent years, and there's more and more ways in which we have technology linked into our varying organisations and in different places. What are you seeing that are impacting businesses from an IoT front?
Well, I mean, the Ring is the good example of the camera doorbell where constantly breached, where people have been able to look at those cameras and see what's going on. Now, in a sense, you don't feel so worried if it's your external camera because it's kind of looking at your drive. If other people look at your drive, do you care? But then there's the nanny cams and the cameras inside the house. There's been even some of the security systems. They left the doors open so their engineers could come back in and watch people in the house, which is very unsettling.
Yes.
And then obviously connected fridges, connected cookers. People have broken into those. So, you're thinking, well, how bad is that? But, you could lose a whole fridge's worth of food. You're talking hundreds of dollars. If they defrost everything in the freezer, if they mess with a cooker, that's just dangerous. So security, again, is not baked into these products because it's let's make it integratable into the sort of, the secure, or not the secure house, but the sort of, cyber house type thing. And so a lot of the times the vendors have to slowly catch up to actually go, let's not have baked in credentials. Let's have it more flexible changes. It is not the first thing on their list again.
Yeah, and we're starting to, we certainly see more reports of where an IoT device of one form or another sort of gets utilised to get a foothold inside an organisation too, right?
Yes, they're not well segmented. So if you could divide off your IT, your cameras, your sensors from the rest of your network, but as you say, because they tend to be all merged together, people get in there because it's so easy, and then they move laterally to more interesting targets.
Now, what else that sort of really, really stands out to you that listeners should be aware of in their organisations? We've covered, a fair bit of ground, but what are the other things that might be jumping out?
Well, our report did say that about a quarter of all organisations have no asset database, so they don't know what they have, and you can't secure what you don't know you have. So you're kind of blind to a lot of the things in your business. So have you got some really old servers or servers that are running in a corner that you do not know about? If you don't, they're not patched, so they're not going to be running at the latest versions of software. There might even be end of life, end of support. So the vendors don't care anymore, and so they're not pushing automatic patches down.
Yep.
So, and also you're not monitoring it, so you won't see any funny activity that might indicate there's a compromise. So really not knowing what assets you have in the business means you can't even start the security journey because you're only going to do it on the ones you do know about. And there's a whole blind spot, which just means that there's a massive area for attackers to play in to their heart's content.
Yeah, and that is quite an interesting area to look at because organisations will run a range of technologies, a range of tools, and they won't necessarily always have a tool that touches every single piece of technology. So it does become a challenge if you've got those things sitting around that are completely kind of outside of management. And some of those types of things might run a Linux operating system that could get taken over and then used to get around and do other things.
Yeah, and if it used to be that someone just had a list on a spreadsheet or something of all these assets, they've left the business. So suddenly it's disappeared because, as we all know, when people leave the business, a lot of documents just get forgotten.
Yeah.
So without that centralized database, that knowledge disappears with individuals.
Yeah.
And that is a big risk to the organization.
Yeah. Now, one of the areas we often hear about in the cybersecurity world is how long it takes from a bad actor, getting into, a system until maybe they're found out. How have those stats been changing? Because we've had a fair bit of movement there.
Well, it kind of depends on what the attacker is looking for. Some of them can dwell for so long. So, I mean, the Chinese are the classics who dwell for years in systems, slowly understanding them all, collecting data, waiting for an opportunity that really works for them. But that's state level, and they're usually against massive organizations to get IP or to get intelligence. Attackers who are usually after money move much quicker because people have got better. As we said, I do tend to knock a lot of organizations, but they have got better at generally monitoring. So they know they can't spend too long sitting there if they're going to want to attack. So again, we say clicking that email, they've taken over that account. They then might move quite quickly across the organization and then looking for that data and looking to attack.
And in terms of the technologies, advanced threat detection and so on, what's the technology the technologies that are really making the most difference to protect organizations at the moment?
You want the best email filtering system you can get. So that, as I said, it's phishing that is the massive attack. And most of the times, actually, it's got better. I don't know if everyone's experienced it, but there are less phishing emails usually in your inbox that you have to report. So those detection tools. So definitely make sure you've got a good one. Make sure that if you are getting a lot of spam emails through, you're talking to the provider or, sorting out improving the way it works, because that will take out a massive threat vector from the organization.
Yep.
A good endpoint on all laptops and servers. A lot of the ones now have sort of either called enhanced detect and respond. So they will detect malicious activity and actually do something about it. They'll try and lock stuff down, isolate machines.
Yeah.
That can take a business a long way on a journey of securing stuff.
Yeah, that sort of automation that these tools can do is pretty handy, right? Because not every organisation is in a position to have a resource sitting there 24/7 in terms of a person. And we have this inherent challenge as humans that takes us time to do stuff. So we can hand it over to technology and AI that can automatically respond. That's pretty helpful.
It is, and that's the interesting thing I think about the statistics we see on this. I often talk to a lot of sort of security analysts and admins who say, I went home, I came back in the next day, and sort of Microsoft Defender had 2 things it had blocked and dealt with. And people aren't probably reporting that, but that is a breach that happened, but the systems locked it down. So, that's great. That's Microsoft or the equivalent earning its money and doing the great things for those organizations. And people, were soundly sleeping while it did its job.
And I guess, what about things like, malicious apps and software as a service offerings, browser plugins that people often just install whatever they like on those sort of fronts at times, but those tools, even your I don't know, it could be an online shopping app or a social media app. There's some concerns, aren't there, really, around these particular platforms, and they bring their own risks.
They do. I mean, obviously the mobile phone is slightly different from the laptop. But if you're getting your apps from the sort of the Play stores or the Apple store, they should be slightly better, but they still slip through. So you do have to it's again back to the intelligence of the person. Does this seem right? Who told me about this? Where did I see it? Is it starting to ask for permissions that just don't seem right?
Yeah.
And then again, the same with plugins. It may be great to have one that kind of puts fancy lights around your head or makes interesting things happen, but where did I find this? Why am I doing this? Is always something people do have to sort of take. And the same applies to phishing and all other those behaviors. Take a few seconds to just think about it. Is this a good idea? That usually saves many people. And then if you're still not sure, ask someone else. Just get a second opinion. And usually between that, you'll sort of sort out a lot of the issues.
How much are you seeing, the organisations you work with now start to, control access to things like browser plugins and having a list of plugins that are acceptable for an organisation, and then blocking access to the rest? Is that becoming a bit more?
It is.
Normal?
It's very rigorous. It's really. I mean, Intune, Microsoft's Intune is a big way to do this, where there's a build for your laptop gets pushed down to you. You can't change that, and that has taken a lot of that away. And people screamed a lot when it tended to happen, saying, no, I need to, as you say, add in these little bits of extra software, do these things. But it turns out they can actually do their job quite happily with a sort of Intune build.
Yeah.
So that has been a great improvement.
Yep. So sort of looking forward from here, what do you expect the trends to be sort of going ahead this year, and what's the sort of the top warnings that you're sharing?
Definitely AI on that social engineering front. It's really going to be powerful for those people. So you're going to have to put processes in place to protect yourself as an organization, particularly around financial things. So take it away from technology, those processes, make them somewhat, go and check with someone else. It needs an extra sign off for something to change. So having sensible manual processes at the back end to stop you is going to be absolutely key for some of those things. Defensive AI is always going to lag behind offensive AI. So relying on an AI tool to save you from AI is unfortunately never really going to happen, because all defensive companies actually have to have a product that works. So they're going to take time to have market tested it, practiced before they launch it, because if it doesn't work, that's them sunk.
And it has to work kind of, close to 100% of the time.
It does.
To be useful, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's going back to, those checks and balances, those two people who need to approve the changes. So it won't be for everything, but you do have to think, going back to where are my risks, and they tend to be around financial stuff for organizations losing money, and then, giving people access to really sensitive data. Should I have a sort of privileged identity management process, which goes, most of the time I can't. If I need to, I have to raise a request that says, I need to do this because X, Y, Z. It gets approved, off I go and do it.
Yeah, it's a very useful mechanism, isn't it? The privileged access management, and I guess you get some quite good benefits of not having administrators with sort of full access to all systems all the time.
And certainly, I've had those rights in the past. You sleep a lot easier not having them, because that you're less of a risk to the business, and you don't have to worry quite so much.
Yeah. And one of the things that we discussed at the launch of the report was what seems to be a growing threat, which is bad actors targeting individuals within an organisation. Maybe they found them on LinkedIn or through other mechanisms, and working to manipulate individuals to then carry out things on their behalf, such as opening up access. What can you share about what's happening from that perspective?
So the more professional attackers will scan through LinkedIn, see who's employees of this company. LinkedIn's very detailed. You may say, I'm a system admin at this company, and they go, well, you're probably going to have admin credentials. Now they can take one of two options, and both of these do happen in the real world. They can threaten you, say, we know where you live. We'll send someone around to shoot you unless you do X, Y, and Z. Tends to be less effective because, especially in New Zealand, you probably believe they can't shoot you because they could be somewhere very far away. But that is an option.
And why would they?
Why would they? Yeah, it just seems a little unlikely, but they still try that in some places. But the more is, I'll bribe you. I will give you, a bit of Bitcoin. I'll give you some Ethereum. You give me your credentials. You've got MFA. I will, at around this time, I will, log into the system. Just press yes on the MFA login. No one will know that, you did it willingly. It will just look like we managed to break the system. So that one is quite a powerful one. And, especially if it's a slightly disgruntled employee, they haven't got promoted, haven't had a pay rise, don't like their boss, they'd be more than willing to take that approach. So we probably think that one is quite underreported, because people just go, an admin account got breached, and it tends to be less common that people then investigate and find out, actually, we looked at the admin's phone and we saw they were having a conversation with the suspicious address and talking about how much Bitcoin they would get for allowing us to get access.
Yeah. And so what are the mechanisms to minimize those sort of risks? Because you can't close all of the risks and all of the the doors, right?
You can't back that. Privileged access management is key, so they have to go and make a very obvious choice. So that makes it a little bit harder. But yeah, it gets back to HR to a sense. If you've got disgruntled employees, you want to remove the disgruntlement if you can. But if you don't, then you kind of have to know when you do have problem employees in an organization, how do you manage them? And it goes back to the same as the chronic clickers. How does a company manage people who are a risk to it?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot packed in there, Alistair. Anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, I think we fired a lot at people. It's a lot to take in. I mean, it does seem quite bad, but as most people will experience, it doesn't tend to usually affect you that much. So, yeah, don't have sleepless nights about it.
Yeah, I think if there are things from a cybersecurity perspective that are, causing you worry or sleepless nights, then that's where you get on and get somebody involved to help out, right?
You do, and raising it up the organisation. If you're kind of lower down, you do need to raise it up, because that is where the power and importance comes from, and the giving money and time to it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely try and raise it up. It's not always easy, but those conversations do need to be had, because hiding stuff just makes it worse.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining the show. And look, really appreciative to, Kordia for doing this report. And, I guess, it's one of your mechanisms to keep you out in front of Kiwis. But, it is actually a really valuable resource for New Zealand organisations to be able to draw on. And, I think encourages all of us to be looking out for where we can step up and where we can do better. So thank you once again.
It's my pleasure. It's great to talk to everyone.
Yeah. Great, awesome. Well, thanks very much, and of course, big thank you to our show partners, to Gorilla Technology, HP, Spark, 2 Degrees, and 1NZ. And you can find the report if you want to look that up through the Kordia website,
yes.
Right? So it's called the New Zealand Business Cybersecurity 2025, for those that want to pull that down and delve into the data. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and if you've been listening to the audio, make sure you are following us across sort of social media and video platforms to get access to our video episodes. All right, thank you. We'll catch you on the next episode. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.